Well, here I am in Berlin once again, talking to a near sellout crowd once again. This is a fun talk for me, though, because I get to do something that I haven't been able to do as much in my career at Magento, and that is brag shamelessly about other people's work. That's what we get for being in the open source world. I'm going to start, as I think is appropriate, any talk about Magento and its history. I'm going to start in the beginning. When humankind was given a gift, a great and powerful gift. You probably didn't notice this in the original painting. OS Commerce. Who here has worked with OS Commerce before? A couple of you. Okay, myself included. Sometimes when I talk about OS Commerce, people laugh. I like to remind them not to laugh, because I think OS Commerce taught us, it taught us some pretty good lessons. Not that we appreciated those lessons, I think, until many, many years later. I myself was guilty of casting aspersions at what was pretty much a phenomenal development in the world of commerce, and something that actually got my career going. For those of you who, and this happens as I get older, we use the term older because it sounds like it'll last a little bit longer than old. That's a George Carlin joke. As I get older, I do realize that some people have never even heard of OS Commerce. But at the time, what we had was, well, you grab the software, you ostensibly had some kind of merchant requirement. So you go out, you find this software solution, you put it in place, and you start to configure it, right? Typical e-commerce software installation. And then invariably, you realize that you need to make changes. The great thing about it was, A, it proved that open source could even vie for attention in the commerce space. It also proved, even though what was originally called the Exchange project, that's what became OS Commerce, started out in the days of PHP 3. In fact, in the early installations of OS Commerce, you would still find some PHP 3 files. But it proved that PHP 4 was marginally viable for the complexities of e-commerce applications. One of the really magical things, though, as you figured out that you needed to get into customizations beyond the accessibility of PHP, I think, getting people into the world of programming, myself included, was the advent of extensions, right? Back then, you would go and you'd invariably need to add some new fields to products, right? It wasn't really an intuitive way to do this inside OS Commerce, or you needed any other number of changes or additions to the functionality. And a lot of this stuff, a lot of this work was already done. It was already there waiting for you to discover in this marketplace that grew organically. OS Commerce taught us some hard lessons, though. Whereas commerce is pretty much always a custom pursuit, doing that in a way that means you can maintain that, or even hope to upgrade the core software, is a bit challenging. We also learned from the project that product development was really, really hard without strong, centralized direction. We know this because Milestone 2 sat there for I don't know how many years. There were lots of there was lots of talk, there were lots of conversations around how to move the project forward. There were numerous forks. Many of you probably dealt with one of the forks of the project or some other software that was inspired by it. There were dozens over the years. But despite the difficulties, the shortcomings, we waited, and we worked with what we had. I myself know I was working with OS Commerce from about 2002 all the way well into 2007. So we waited, and we waited. And if I were any good at slides, you'd see that says 2006 right there at the bottom. We waited a very long time for a lot of things to develop. And then Magento came along at like the almost right moment. I mean, the almost right moment. Like another couple of years, and we would have had things like GitHub and maybe some intelligent package management. Convenient things like testing would have been more in vogue and probably would have made it into the core. But as it happened in 2006, a really tiny agency in LA was handling increasingly bigger and bigger, more complex, more visible clients. And they had some very sharp developers working for them. And they were having a really, really hard time delivering professional work based on OS Commerce. And so they grew weary. And in so growing weary, they, the very entrepreneurial founders, Roy Rubin and Yoav Kutner, they kind of turned the problem on its head a little bit and said, hey, well, you know, rather than just relying on what the market has available, why don't we build something for the market? Or actually create a market on our own. And I was actually recently hiking with this, with Roy, and he very clearly actually set out to take over the world with this commerce solution. I don't know that I would have had the guts to do it, but they invested some time and money, and they conceived Magento, and then began work in earnest. So depending on who you ask, it started right at the beginning of 2007. Really, I think the first, like maybe some of the ORM was begun around December 2006. But the whole goal was flexibility as a first-class citizen with a goal that you can make changes, and those changes would persist even through upgrades. Now, I will say that was an aim. Sometimes fell a little bit off the mark, but in general, we had something that had never really been seen before: the ability to change for an open source e-commerce platform to change so much of the core behavior while still having an upgrade path. Also, they built this thing for merchants of all size. And they made a deliberate decision from the beginning. They knew, just like they had come to rely on OS Commerce and the fact that OS Commerce had remained viable for so long, that they needed to do this out in the world of open source. But why? Why go to this open source this open source paradigm when so many people, especially in that era, were all about protecting trade secrets? Well, it was because they were a very small company. I forget what their size was at release, but certainly fewer than 100. I think probably about 30. I don't know. Anton, do you know? No. So I think about 30 or so. This is at Magento 1's release. But they knew if they worked with, if they relied on open source, if they did things the open source way, they would end up with effectively this hugely distributed product team, right? And that means more eyes, more people spending time building the core functionality, ultimately a better project. It's very much like the beautiful, beautiful waters flowing together in harmony. Stay with me, stay with me. Flowing together in harmony, and then all going to action. That's the intent, right? I found this picture. It was free on the internet. The reality, of course, at the time was a little bit different. I say we. I wasn't part of it then. Well, basically, it was a bit like drinking from the fire hose, right? So they had a bunch of enthusiasm on the one hand, but no real means of actually accepting the contributions. Now think about our time frame here. This was, the release was, 2008, right? So we didn't really have GitHub. GitHub was nascent at the time. This whole idea of social, collaborative version control and contribution, that this basically was done maybe with a repository and some email lists. So the picture of contribution was a much different picture back then. Some highlights from this era: if you wanted to contribute to the Magento core, if you wanted to contribute to an e-commerce platform, an online, that's the internet, online e-commerce platform, you needed to send a fax. You needed to download a PDF. You needed to fill out this PDF by hand and then fax that motherfucker back to someone in LA. And this actually didn't seem abnormal, right? This didn't really, some people knew that this wasn't ideal, but this is not a very open source experience. It doesn't induce people to contribute. And in the world of open source, if you don't maintain an open source project yourself, I'll tell you, it's a lot like, customers in a checkout funnel. You want to reduce the friction as much as you can. In fact, the problems that got solved, because at the time, Varian, the company behind Magento, that would eventually become Magento, was still an agency. So they still had e-commerce clients. They had these e-commerce clients all the way up right to the end of 2010. On one hand, that's good, right, because they're dog fooding. They're using their own product, but in terms of accepting contributions, prioritizing contributions, really it's, okay, what is the biggest fire that our feet are being held to right now? And that's what we'll put in. Not a very good experience if you have a problem that you want to solve and you're trying to get something merged into the core. So as I said, online open source, the reason we just didn't have what we have now for collaboration. Kind of compounding the lack of tools available. I mean, you had an SVN endpoint, right? So just this read-only place to get the code sometimes when it's updated according to some schedule. And you had a very small internal team. They're already taxed. Like, it is, I think, never the case that an agency just simply has developers laying around follow, playing foosball and other things. They didn't plan any extra capacity to accept any of the input coming in. All right. And probably maybe most tragically, I don't know, it's tied for first along with the whole faxed CLA, was the fact that all of the core development is happening behind this big orange curtain. There's no visibility into the architecture. The plans weren't actually being discussed. Magento itself wasn't really being out there. I mean, you had developers in LA, you had developers in Kiev. So you didn't really have much access to see what was going on, to even know how to contribute. So not an ideal open source experience. And yet, and I'll own this again, even though I didn't join for years later, I was still, at this point, I was part of the community. We draped ourselves in the beautiful, beautiful velvety clothing of open source, simply because, guess what? Human beings could read the code. You had to read the code. There wasn't any documentation. That's a different presentation. But I've sensed everyone leaning a little bit forward in the chairs, waiting for the hero to come roaring in. And then 2011, I was there in LA teaching the developer class when this happened. Big cheers and hurrahs as eBay comes in to save the day. We go behind the big primary multicolor curtains, and we got a lot of resources from eBay. We were able to hire a lot of people, invest a lot in development, build out products